No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there, walked alone. Shirley Jackson, The Haunting of Hill House. I've talked before about both good and bad film adaptations of books, but today I want to talk about one specific television adaptation of one of the greatest horror novels of all time. The television series I'm looking at today is the Netflix adaptation of Shirley Jackson's 1959 classic, The Haunting of Hill House. If you've never read The Haunting of Hill House, you should. Stephen King reviewed the book in his nonfiction review of the genre, 1981's Danse Macabre, calling it, quote, one of the finest horror novels of the late 20th century, end quote. It regularly lands on lists of the best horror novels ever written, and rightly so. Now here's a quick synopsis of the novel from the Penguin Classics edition, if you're not familiar with it. 4 seekers have arrived at the rambling old pile known as Hill House. Dr. Montague, an occult scholar looking for solid evidence of psychic phenomenon. Theodora, his lovely and light-hearted assistant. Luke, the adventurous future inheritor of the estate. And Eleanor, a friendless, fragile young woman with a dark past. As they begin to cope with chilling, even horrifying occurrences beyond their control or understanding, they cannot possibly know what lies ahead. For Hill House is gathering its powers, and soon it will choose one of them to make its own. It's a gothic, creepy, slow burn of a story that adheres well to Alfred Hitchcock's maxim that there's no terror in the bang, only in the anticipation of it. No jump scares here, just a steady increase in that feeling of unease you got as a kid, watching your closet door after hearing a bump in the night. No slasher novel or film comes close to that. But Jackson's novel takes us even further down the psychological wormhole, because right up to the end, we're never totally sure if the supernatural occurrences are real or simply in Eleanor's mind. Shirley Jackson said she believed the ghosts were real, as did Henry James when talking about the ghost in his novel, The Turn of the Screw. But you can't always count on authors to give you the whole story. The novel was a sensation when it was released in 1959. It was a finalist for the National Book Award, and it spawned 2 film versions, both retitled The Haunting. The 1963 version was faithful to the novel and remains a fine film over 50 years later. The 1999 remake was a disaster that should never have been made. Which brings us to the 2018 Netflix series, The Haunting of Hill House. It was, quite frankly, one of the best shows I've seen in years, from the acting to the direction to the writing. It has an 8.7 out of 10 on imdb.com, which just doesn't happen very often. Here's the funny part. If you've read the book and seen the series, you know already that they have very little in common other than the title and the house, at least on the surface. So why would I consider it an excellent adaptation? I'm glad you asked. But first, a quick blurb on the series for those who haven't seen it yet. The plot alternates between 2 timelines, one following 5 adult siblings whose paranormal experiences at Hill House haunt them to the present day, and the other showing flashbacks of the events leading up to the fateful night in 1992 when the family fled the house in the middle of the night. Sounds like 2 different stories, right? Well, that's because it is. and it isn't. It would have been easy for writer-director Mike Flanagan to simply do a remake of the 1963 film, but any remake was likely to be seen as inferior at best. So he did something that's rarely attempted in risk-averse filmmaking today. He adapted the spirit of the book while telling his own story. Flanagan took the central figure in Jackson's novel, Hill House itself, and made it his central character as well. And it's from that framework, that spine, if you will, that everything flows. He kept the slow burn, gothic, creeping feeling of unease, as well as a surprisingly small number of jump scares for a 10-episode horror series. And like the novel, we wonder throughout how much is actually real and how much is in the characters' heads. Although with the series, it's a little bit more clear-cut than it was in the book. For those who read the novel first, Flanagan also gives numerous nods to the novel as well. 3 of the children are named after 3 of the 4 main characters in the novel: Luke, Theo, and Eleanor, or Nell. The caretakers, Mr. and Mrs. Dudley, also make the jump from the book to the television series. And even Dr. Montague appears in the show, this time as Nell's psychiatrist, and incidentally, played by Russ Tamblyn, who played Luke in the 1963 film version. How cool is that? Now, there are other nods to the book. One of the siblings is named Shirley, after Shirley Jackson. In one episode, young Theo is seen reading a copy of The Lottery, which was also written by Shirley Jackson. And in multiple places, scenes from the novel are incorporated into events or dialogue, most notably at the very start of the series, where Stephen, the oldest sibling, reads from his own book titled The Haunting of Hill House, an account of what the family experienced. The lines he reads in the voiceover are the first paragraph of the novel, word for word. I've used that paragraph as the epigraph for this episode. Now at this point, let me caution that it will be easier, I think, to move from reading the novel to watching the adaptation than the other way around. Regardless, I'm just glad that the other way around is happening. The massive success of the series sparked a renewed interest in the novel and caused people to either reread it or read it for the first time. Even classics, maybe especially classics, can fall out of favor and need a spark to get back in front of people. The series did that for The Haunting of Hill House and Jackson's other works as well, which is a very good thing. Now, earlier I mentioned Stephen King's review of the novel. Well, he had something to say about the series as well, this time in the following tweet. He said, "The Haunting of Hill House, revised and remodeled by Mike Flanagan. I don't usually care for this kind of revisionism, but this is great. Close to a work of genius, really. I think Shirley Jackson would approve, but who knows for sure." And as just a little insight into why it's clear Flanagan is a true fan of the genre as well as a director, here was his reply to King's tweet. "Someday I'll figure out how to react to things like this without shrieking like a little kid. But today is not that day." I get it, Mike. I felt the same way when both Neil Gaiman and Joe Hill favorited one of my tweets. So clearly, I like the show as much as King and millions of others. I also love the novel, though Joe Hill's Heart-Shaped Box remains my all-time favorite horror novel. But let me circle back to why both are so great. It's the writing. With Shirley Jackson, that goes without saying. Too often, with excellent films and television shows, it should be said, but isn't even noticed. The Haunting of Hill House series indeed has great sets and direction and acting from one of the best casts I've seen in a long time. But none of that would matter if the writing wasn't equally as good. Story matters. It always has and always will. Whether told around a campfire, or in a film, or on stage, or in a book. If you're looking for a great story, told in two different ways. Read the book and binge watch the series. You'll be glad you did, even if horror isn't normally your thing. We'll see you next time. Keep on reading.